Hello, and welcome to the Decent Ideas podcast, where decent needn't necessarily mean polite in an indecent time, nor should it mean perfect for obvious reasons. What it must mean is fitting and suitable to that time. I'm Terence. So last time you got a little intro into me as your host, and we compared and contrasted hashtag Force the Vote and a right-wing hashtag in terms of their relative successes and failures and what they mean for the future of our politics. But since we also touched on people out of power as compared to people in power, I thought I'd center that conversation this episode in terms of a topic where that disparity is front and center. So that topic is the justice system and an approach to it that we haven't really tried in this country on any kind of large scale, which is to say restorative justice. So to that end, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Capitol Hill riots, which are, of course, a very fresh topic as we approach Trump's second impeachment trial in the coming days. I also want to talk about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's experience of the riots and her choice to go public about her experience with assault. And I might touch a couple of other sort of subtopics along the way with regard to current people in power. So to get us started, we should talk a little bit about what restorative justice is. So it's meant to be an approach to justice which includes or is sort of centered around a meeting between involved parties and sometimes the wider community that's involved in a perceived wrong that has been done. And sort of the goal is to create a consensus on the narrative of what happened between these two parties, the wrongdoer, shall we say, and the one who was wronged, and then to create a consensus on how to repair the damaged parties and the wider community, of course, especially what the offender can do to right the wrong and sort of restore the community as close as possible to its previous state. So on a large scale, restorative justice looks something like what some call a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, sometimes just shortly put as Truth Commission. So this has been applied in South Africa after apartheid. It's been attempted in Rwanda, as well as many sort of other widespread conflicts like in the former Yugoslavia and what have you. And sort of the idea is basically similar, but on a larger scale. It's a meeting between the wronged parties to kind of go through what happened, share your narrative in order to create a larger narrative, and again, work out how to achieve a new sense of restoration after this wrongdoing that has taken place. So by contrast, sort of the opposite side of the spectrum is retributive justice. By contrast, retributive justice is an approach to justice which is based on codified and dispassionate law. So when the idea being when an offender breaks the law, they must suffer, for lack of better terminology, in proportion to the offense. So it's meant to be directed at the wrongdoing more so than the wrongdoer. It's more about, assuring that wrongdoing it takes place less frequently. And it's also based on this idea of burden of proof, which is generally on the accuser to demonstrate through evidence that the wrongdoing occurred. And it's often the burden of proof can be generally somewhere between preponderance of the evidence, meaning you have more evidence to support your case than the defense has against the case, as opposed to the sort of higher standard or highest standard, I would say, which we apply in the US, which is beyond a reasonable doubt. So at the risk of getting too sort of in the weeds, we won't go too far into, defining what a crime is. But generally a crime it's a category that's created by a legal system. So types of crimes that are sort of universal across human civilization are assault, theft, and murder. And obviously in our country and in many other sort of systems similar to ours, there's a difference between civil and criminal law. But a lot of this, like I say, is kind of beyond the scope of the discussion I want to have today. So maybe we'll have an opportunity to return to them in a future episode. So, like I said, we're talking about the difference between retributive and restorative justice. And like I say, I wanted to apply that to, first off, the Capitol Hill riots and what happened there. And as we're moving to adjudicate that at the highest level with Trump, with former President Donald Trump, I should say, as well as adjudicate, the lower level crimes that have taken place by those who directly invaded the Capitol building. And basically, I just wanted to get into, kind of what we're looking at there. So one of the starkest responses to the Capitol Hill riots has been this idea that we need to institute a kind of Patriot Act 2.0, a kind of approach to domestic terrorism that creates some new legal framework for prosecuting people that commit terrorism domestically. And this strikes me as a very sort of, first of all, it's a very retributive approach, right? It's about prosecuting more people, but also it's a very striking response in that, we went through this already, right? So the first Patriot Act was about surveilling in order to try and prevent or to catch before things get too out of hand, crime of terrorism by someone from abroad. And so the concern has become, are we being too aggressive by creating these new statutes? And obviously they've been applied very widely. And so now the question becomes, we're looking at what's happening in our country, this terrible thing that happened that was incited by folks in power, by folks adjacent to power. Some recent footage came out of Roger Stone, who's a major confidant of the former president, of him basically being with, I believe the group was the Oath Keepers, which is one of the white supremacist groups that he was there on the day of. So in addition to, Senators Cruz and Hawley being, proximal to and involved in and engaged in, at least peripherally, what should happen? How should we, how should we stop the election from being stolen from Donald Trump as they saw it? And so here we are, right, at this time where the last number that I saw was somewhere approaching 200 people have been arrested or charged in involvement in the Capitol Hill riots. And so the question becomes, are we approaching this the right way? Is to a large extent, these people were acting out of a perceived wrongdoing that wasn't based in truth, right? So the way I've been starting to think about this is in the sort of restorative model, right, where we have a country that's deeply divided on what the truth is of what's going on in our country. And it strikes me that we have an opportunity to start thinking about how do we, the term is unite the country. How do we reunite the country at a time when it's pretty clear we're very divided and don't trust each other? And where I kind of come down on this is prosecuting people. There's an element of the right that is very convinced that the woman who was killed, Ashley Babbitt, who was shot on the Capitol, that she's been made something of a martyr on the right, and that the FBI is on high alert about sort of copycat attacks taking place. And so it makes you wonder, are we taking the right approach to this problem? And it strikes me that we seriously need to consider other models, right? So like I say, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as applied in South Africa and Rwanda and other places, is I think, at least a worthy framework to consider. Can we start the conversation if people are willing to admit, right? So like I say, restorative justice is about creating a narrative jointly about what happened and about what should be done about what happened. So the biggest struggle, as with most attempts to apply restorative justice, is how do we do this in a way that people feel, first of all, comfortable coming forward, but also feel supported enough to admit the wrong, right? And so I see us, like I say, at an inflection point as we approach this trial, as I've said, where we can start to think, okay, is it time for us to start finding a new way forward? The thing that's crazy about our system is how ingrained we are within it. So, as I've started to say with the last episode, the idea is just to look at these problems in a new light, to look at these problems and say, is there is there a different way that we can approach this? And what's interesting about the Capitol Hill riots is, at least in theory, and I haven't reviewed all of the cases of the people that have been arrested or charged. At least in theory, these people represent folks from different classes of American society. Of course, they're overwhelmingly one racial or ethnic group of the country, but that part of this is a question of education. Are we educating people to process news appropriately and determine what's true, what's false? But I think I'm getting off track. So let me sort of try and rezone in here. So we're looking at, can we introduce a new element to the system that says, okay, this thing that happened was terrible, and we want to be able to move on as a society in such a way that it doesn't happen again, that there aren't a spate or a continuation of politically motivated attacks based on this false premise that was created by a certain element of the right, and that includes the former president of the United States. So I think when I take a look at this, I see an opportunity to, like I say, if people are willing to come forward and feel comfortable enough to admit their wrongdoing, then we have an opportunity to create a new narrative and say, this is the thing we agree that happened. It was terrible. It was wrong. It threatened the lives of representatives of our democracy. We want to have a democracy in this country. And how can we move forward? What is the right way to go about repairing the damage? Community service is one of those things that's sort of right at the line where, obviously, it's retributive in the sense that community service for crime is imposed upon the defendant. If the defendant should lose in a criminal or civil case, it can be imposed upon the defendant. The difference here with restorative justice is that there's a concordance on how to move forward. So, as I say this, it because it's so ingrained, I feel myself recognizing how sort of silly it might come across to some, to say, let's all get around the fire and kumbaya. But in some senses, the idea of restorative justice, and there have been studies done, I'll see if I can pull up some for reference for later on, but there have been some studies done that suggest that restorative justice is in some ways a better system because it discourages recidivism. It discourages people from going back and doing the same thing again. The way that we have a problem in this country with repeat offenders of crimes. So if we were to move to a system that's more restorative, less retributive, we might find that we need to put less people in prison, which seems like maybe a positive for our economy, for our society, for the fabric of our relationships with each other. So in terms of this Capitol Hill riots, again, as we approach a very retributive process for Donald Trump to determine whether or not he should be barred from attaining federal office again, whether he should be convicted by the Senate, there's an opportunity to start, I think, a discussion about is there a better way forward for our system. And so that brings me to sort of another subtopic here about, what went on. And this was very well articulated by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Representative AOC, as many know her, where she went live on her Instagram to say, to discuss her experience of the Capitol Hill riots. And as it happened, she also took it as an opportunity to express her previous survival of sexual assault. And she spoke about it in the context of the degree to which we are conditioned as a society not to believe survivors, to doubt survivors, which, to be honest, I hadn't been exposed to that idea of, sort of beyond the sexual violence capacity, the idea that, oh, as it turns out, it kind of is the case that we tend to not believe survivors of other types of violence, of other crimes. That hadn't occurred to me before. And it goes back to this sort of broader question about, do we live in a system that unfairly puts the burden on the victim of a crime to demonstrate that a crime occurred? And this goes to the heart of this discussion between restorative and retributive justice. So, she spoke very eloquently, and I'll make no, illusion of the fact that I'm an AOC fan, if you will, but she spoke very eloquently about what had happened, the way that she was approached by a Capitol Hill officer, and the way that she felt that her life was at risk. And the story's been corroborated by her fellow representative, Katie Porter, whose office she sheltered in. And this goes to, like I say, this relationship between the kind of justice system we have and a potential kind of other justice system we could have. And in light of my own personal experience, so I brought up at the last episode, our first episode, 2 experiences that I personally have that have shaped my views on these issues and my approach, my sort of systemic minded approach to problem solving and conflict resolution. And those 2 things were living in Cameroon before what they call the Anglophone problem. It's also known as the Cameronian Civil War, wherein 2 provinces of the country are English-speaking because they previously belonged to the British occupation, the British colonization of what then became Nigeria, as opposed to the neighboring 8, I believe it is, French provinces. And so these countries, when independence was achieved, were kind of mashed together into this 10-province country called Cameroon. And it has been argued, I believe quite convincingly, that these English regions have been marginalized by their government, and that has resulted in a nationalistic movement to gain independence from Francophone Cameroon as opposed to Anglophone Cameroon. So this was an experience that I had that has really shaped my view on conflict. And then the second one is my experience as a survivor of sexual assault on multiple occasions by one person. So the reason I bring these up is because I saw pretty obviously a parallel to AOC, to the Capitol Hill riots, and interestingly, to previous allegations of sexual assault against the current president of the United States, the prime example being of Tara Reade, who accused him of outright sexual assault, whereas there have been other accusations against the current president that amounted more on the sort of harassment side as opposed to the assault side of the spectrum of sexual indiscretion, sexual violence. And it was striking to me to see this example of AOC speaking so boldly and getting a lot of support, but also a lot of backlash, and sort of the reemergence of the Me Too hashtag at the same time, where not too long ago, another person came forward with, under the auspices of the idea that we should believe survivors, and was shunned from public life, effectively, was shunned from being able to tell her story. And it feels like a bit of a tangent, but I think it's an important one, which is we have a very uneven way of approaching justice in this country. We have a way of favoring the powerful and marginalizing the less powerful. And this is actually, I think, one of the prime reasons why I think restorative justice is such a powerful model, because what it gets at is this idea of, when a crime is committed, when someone is wronged, it doesn't affect just the two parties directly involved. And this is the case with the Capitol Hill riots just as much as it's the case with sexual violence, that we see the repercussions of these crimes. We see them reverberate throughout our society. And we have an opportunity to take a new, maybe somewhat Pollyannish approach under some folks' belief system to say, okay, a really ugly thing happened. And our natural approach is to seek retribution, right? Is to seek punishment for the wrongdoing. But it just might be the case that we are highly evolved enough organisms that we can say, okay, maybe just seeking punishment, which of course invites defensiveness and leads to that sort of legal system that we see portrayed so much in our media of, oh, I didn't do that. No, I plead innocent. That didn't happen. That the sort of framework of our legal system is very much about, you did a wrong thing and you deserve to pay for it. And the response being, I did not do the wrong thing. No, I refuse to agree that I did the wrong thing. And so let's go to our corners. Let's invite a jury of our peers to come and say, present the evidence. Let's find out, did this thing happen the way that the accuser suggests that it happened? And if we can prove beyond a reasonable doubt in most cases for, the bigger offenses, can we prove what happened beyond a reasonable doubt? If we can so prove, then the punishment is inflicted. If we can start to look past that one particular model of how justice can be done and start thinking, is there an opportunity to restore our society, restore the lives of those two people, or however many, people are involved, restore them to our society in a way that the damage is repaired to the extent possible? Sounds kind of cool if you think about it. And I think the other thing that's really interesting about the restorative justice model is the idea, I mentioned it already, which is, creating the narrative together, saying, I recognize that I did wrong, and I want us to come to a mutual understanding of what happened. And there's a whole body of research around how unreliable our memories are, and this is especially the case in issues of sexual violence. But if we can recognize what happened and agree upon what happened, then maybe we have another way forward. And by the way, the sort of last element that I think is actually probably the strongest element of this is, it's about determining together what is the action that the offender can do to right the wrong. To me, that's very powerful, because it allows the offender into the discussion so that society can come away repaired. And by the way, we live in a system where, if you do the wrong thing, you carry that burden for the rest of your life. So one of the things I think is very powerful about restorative justice is this idea that perhaps you don't. Perhaps if we find the right pathway forward, you don't have to carry this for the rest of your life. And so this gets to, I think, sort of getting close to the end of the discussion here. So what I'd like to discuss is two things that I see that could keep restorative justice from being not just a decent idea, but a great idea. And so that would be, number one, drawing the wrong line between crimes that should be handled retributively and restoratively. I do happen to believe that, crimes of full-on, assault and harm to somebody, of theft at a large scale, shall we say, and that murder, we have no choice, I think, but to handle those things retributively. Sexual violence is an interesting caveat in that it's a in many cases a kind of assault, but one in which the burden of proof can be more difficult to ascertain because it's intimate. There's usually only two or so involved parties, so eyewitness reports and testimony are more difficult to come by. So it begs the question of, is the burden of proof correct? And also, should because it's so difficult to ascertain an affirmative conviction, should we pursue a more restorative model because justice is more achievable in this case? And I've evaluated this a lot in the case of my own assaults. And one of the struggles that I've had is that my assaulter refuses to take accountability for what happened. So when I talk about it in restorative terms, I talk about how, I've lost friends because I treated my assaulter in such a way that our mutual friends thought I was the one doing the wrong, when really I was just responding, as it turns out, innately, because I actually had a lot of trouble recovering the memories of my trauma. And so this was all subconscious. But the damage that was done was that I couldn't function the same way in relationships that I previously had until I recovered the memory years later. And that this harmed my other relationships. It harmed my assaulter's other relationships. And so I think there's a real opportunity in the case of sexual violence to have a real conversation about, is restorative justice a better model? Because again, so first off, more difficult to prove, but second off, this is one of those crimes, if proven affirmatively, is a stamp upon the perpetrator's life forever. And I think if we were to approach it from a standard of, okay, how do we restore our society, or our small community, or whatever the proper level is, if we restore our community, then perhaps this isn't something that has to stay with the person who did the wrong forever. And by the way, I think the same standard makes sense when you're talking about such a broad number of perpetrators in the Capitol Hill riots. So perhaps it doesn't make sense to just put all these people in jail, because what that creates is a sense of them being wronged in a sort of eye for an eye, Code of Hammurabi, kind of view on justice. And in doing so, it creates resentment, which fosters, a cycle of retribution. And so I think there's a real opportunity to at least start the discussion here. And by the way, this applies historically as well. I think our country has not sufficiently, by any means, addressed some of the bigger crimes against humanity that our forefathers and foremothers did to Native Americans, to African Americans, to Asian Americans in the case of internment camps, that we haven't done enough to address, the wars ravaged upon the Spanish and the Mexican Americans after the Spanish relinquished their control over what became the country of Mexico. We haven't addressed a lot of these crimes. You can, because history is written by the winners, we often wipe these crimes away from our telling of history, and it fosters resentment, it fosters divisiveness. And so I think we as a country have an opportunity to start thinking about, should we have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission on slavery? should we have a discussion without an eye towards retribution because we don't perhaps have the means to properly facilitate retribution when the crimes are historical, are far in the past. So these are the things that we can think about in terms of where's the right line to draw between crimes that require retributive justice and crimes that require or should engage in restorative justice. And this leads to the other sort of main thing that could keep restorative justice from being a great idea, and that's implementing it in a way and at a time that it distributes justice unevenly. So this is often the case in, imperfect systems of justice, that they aren't addressed in an equitable way. And this applies to a particular area that I think restorative justice would be better implemented than retributive justice, and that is drug crimes and the drug war that is ongoing at our southern border. Anyway, I could get into all this for as long as the day goes, but I thought it was important to, in light of these events that are happening now, in light of these powerful people potentially getting away with things, and the less powerful people perhaps being unfairly treated, or treated in a way that is not proportionate to the crime committed, or doesn't acknowledge the systemic factors or the other parties that gaslit them, that created the environment where their crime felt justified, felt righteous. And so I think I'll leave that for where it is for today. So next time, as I delayed it this episode so we could talk about this, I'll say next time we'll discuss a different way to structure the U.S. system of governance. And the best way to reach me is on Twitter at DecentFed, My project is called the Decent Federalism Project. And so to that end, be decent to one another, and thanks for listening.